The Deep Space Monitoring Station picked up the signal at exactly 3 in the morning ship time, and Jake Morrison knew something was wrong, even before he saw the data. The coffee in his cup was still steaming when the alarm started screaming. Across the bridge of the Starbound, and every screen turned red with emergency warnings from the outer colonies. Jake had been a ship captain for 15 years, and he had seen solar flares and asteroid impacts and even pirate raids, but he had never seen readings like this. The energy signature coming from the Kepler system was impossible according to every law of physics he knew, and the computer kept running diagnostics because it thought the sensors were broken. Lisa Carter rushed onto the bridge with her lab coat, still half-buttoned, and her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was the best xenobiologist in the human fleet, even though she was only 28 years old, and when she saw the readings on Jake's main screen, her face went white. The distress signals started coming in 5 minutes later, and each one was worse than the last. Colony ships that had been reporting normal status just hours before were now screaming about something in space that was eating the stars themselves. The automated beacons from mining stations went silent one by one, like candles being blown. Out by an invisible wind, Jake ordered his communications officer to open a channel to Federation Command, but the response they got back was chaos. The crystal beings, called the Vexhi, were sending panic signals across half the galaxy, and the energy creatures known as the Luminari were abandoning their meditation worlds for the first time in recorded history. The thing they were calling the Devourer had awakened from somewhere deep in space, and it was hungry. The first report seemed like the ravings of terrified colonists, but as more data came in, Jake realized they were dealing with something that should not exist. Entire planets were going dark in a matter of hours, and when the survey ships arrived to investigate, they found nothing but empty space where thriving worlds had been just days before. Lisa worked frantically at her science station trying to make sense of the impossible readings. The creature appeared to be made of some kind of living void that existed between dimensions, and it moved through space like a storm cloud made of pure hunger. It was not just destroying the planets it encountered, but somehow absorbing them completely, as if they had never existed at all. The Vexhi Empire had ruled 1,000 worlds for over 10,000 years, but 3 of their core planets vanished in a single day. The crystalline beings sent their most powerful warships to investigate, and those ships never reported back. Even their quantum communicators, which could send messages instantly across the galaxy, fell silent the moment they got close to whatever was consuming their worlds. Jake found himself staring at star charts that made no sense, because systems that had been there for millions of years were simply gone. The creature was not following any pattern that human minds could understand, and it seemed to be growing stronger with each world it devoured. The energy readings showed that it was getting bigger and moving faster, as if feeding on the life force of entire civilizations was making it more powerful. The Federation had been contacted by dozens of species over the past week, all begging for help against something they could not fight or understand. The proud warrior race called the Krillians had thrown their entire fleet at the creature and watched 10,000 ships disappear without even slowing it down. The peaceful telepathic species known as the Harmony Collective had tried to communicate with it, and their screams echoed across space before falling silent forever. Lisa finally looked up from her instruments with tears in her eyes and told Jake that whatever this thing was, it existed partially outside normal space and time. It could reach through dimensions to grab entire planets and pull them into some kind of void where they continued to exist but under its control. The creature was not just a predator, but something that collected living worlds the way a child might collect toys. The long-range sensors showed the Devourer was beginning to turn toward human space, and Jake knew that their small colonies on the outer rim would not be able to resist something that had destroyed civilizations millions of years old. The Federation was sending desperate messages to every species asking for any kind of help or knowledge that might stop this cosmic horror. Jake made the decision to take his ship toward Federation Central Command to offer whatever assistance humanity could provide, even though most alien species considered human technology to be primitive and their military insignificant. He had no idea what a small exploration vessel could do against something that ate entire star systems, but he knew they had to try, as the Starbound prepared to jump to hyperspace. Jake looked out at the stars and wondered how many of them would still be there when this was over. The creature had consumed 47 inhabited worlds in just 3 weeks, and it showed no signs of slowing down or stopping. Something that had slept in the dark spaces between galaxies for eons had awakened and decided that it was time to feed again. The Federation Central Command Station, called New Geneva, was the largest artificial structure Jake Morrison had ever seen, and right now, it buzzed with more activity than a disturbed anthill. Ships from dozens of different species crowded the docking bays while their crews shared horror stories about the thing that was eating the galaxy one world at a time. Beth Rodriguez met Jake at the airlock, and her usually calm demeanor was cracked with stress lines around her eyes. She had been humanity's liaison to the Federation for 5 years, and she had never seen the alien races this scared before. The proud Vex-High ambassadors were actually trembling, and their crystal bodies flickered with unstable energy patterns. The briefing room was packed with representatives from every major civilization, and they all looked like survivors of some terrible disaster. The insectoid Krillians clicked their mandibles nervously, while the gaseous nebula collective swirled in agitated patterns. Even the ancient Eternal Council members, who claimed to be millions of years old, seemed shaken by what they had witnessed. Beth showed Jake the tactical displays, and the numbers were worse than anything he had imagined. In just 3 weeks, the Devourer had consumed 47 inhabited worlds and countless space installations. The creature was not just randomly hunting, but seemed to be following energy signatures and life concentrations as if it could smell. Living things from across the galaxy, Alex Turner was a theoretical physicist who had been studying the creature's movement patterns, and his findings made everyone in the room even more nervous. The Devourer was learning and adapting with each world it consumed, and it appeared to be heading directly for the galactic core where the most populated systems existed. It was not just mindlessly feeding, but actively seeking out the richest sources of life. The alien representatives shared their people's failed attempts to stop the cosmic horror, and each story was more depressing than the last. The Krillian Republic had sent their entire military force, consisting of over 10,000 of their most advanced warships, and the creature absorbed the entire fleet in less than 15 minutes. The Peaceful Harmony Collective had tried a different approach by sending their most powerful telepaths to establish communication with the entity. The psychic screams of those brave volunteers had echoed across space for hours before falling silent, and now the entire collective was retreating to the far edges of the galaxy. The Vex-High Empire had attempted to use their reality warping technology to simply erase the creature from existence, but their weapons, which could crack planets, barely made the thing slow down. The Luminary Collective had tried to blind it with pure energy attacks that could ignite stars, but the Devourer seemed to feed on energy itself, and only grew stronger. Jake listened to all these stories of failure and felt a growing sense of hopelessness, settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Every advanced civilization in the galaxy had thrown their best technology and their bravest warriors at this thing, and nothing had worked. The creature just kept getting bigger and stronger with each victory. Admiral Grace Sullivan was the highest-ranking human in the Federation military, and she stood up to address the assembled representatives. She was a tough woman who had fought in the border wars against space pirates, and she was not ready to give up without a fight. She argued that sometimes a fresh perspective was exactly what was needed when conventional approaches had failed. Many of the alien representatives were skeptical about humanity's offer to help because humans were newcomers to the galactic community, and their technology was considered primitive by most standards. The Vex-High ambassador pointed out that if weapons capable of destroying planets could not stop the Devourer, then human missiles and lasers would be useless. But Alex Turner had been analyzing the sensor data from all the failed attacks, and he noticed something interesting. The creature seemed to have more trouble absorbing human ships and technology than it did with alien vessels. The difference was small, but it was there, and in a situation this desperate even the smallest advantage might be important. Jake volunteered the human fleet to join the next major attempt to stop the creature, even though he knew they were probably flying to their deaths. The assembled representatives argued about strategy and resources, while outside the station's viewports, more refugee ships arrived carrying survivors from the Devourer's latest victims. The plan they eventually agreed on was desperate, but it was the only option left. Every remaining military vessel from 7 different civilizations would converge on the Nexus system, where the creature was expected to arrive in 2 days. It would be the largest combined fleet in galactic history, with over 15,000 ships, representing the pinnacle of multiple species technology. Jake knew the odds were terrible, but he also knew that someone had to try to stop this thing before it consumed every living world in the galaxy. His ship, the Starbound, would be part of the human contingent, which was tiny compared to the massive alien fleets. But Grace Sullivan had convinced the Federation that every ship would count in the coming battle as the various fleets prepared to depart. Jake found himself looking at tactical displays that showed the Devourer's predicted path through space. The creature was moving faster now, and it seemed to be accelerating toward the most densely populated regions of the galaxy. Whatever this thing was, it had an intelligence behind its hunger, and that made it even more terrifying. Lisa Carter worked frantically in her laboratory trying to find any weakness they could exploit, but the creature seemed to exist partially outside. Normal physics. Her instruments could barely detect it properly, and every reading suggested that they were dealing with something that should not be possible according to everything science knew about reality. The final briefing before departure was somber, and Jake could see in everyone's faces that they all knew this might be a suicide mission. But the alternative was to let the Devourer continue consuming worlds until there was nothing left alive in the galaxy, and that was not an option any of them could accept, as the massive fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. Jake wondered if humanity's small contribution would make any difference at all, but he knew they had to try because sometimes trying was all you could do when faced with impossible odds. The battle at Nexus System became a demonstration of how hopeless their situation really was, and Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the Starbound as the largest military fleet in galactic history prepared to face something that should not exist. 15,000 ships from 7 different civilizations spread across space in perfect formation with weapons that could reshape reality itself. When the Devourer emerged from hyperspace, it was like watching a wound tear open in the fabric of space itself. The creature was massive beyond anything Jake had ever imagined, and it moved like living darkness that bent light around itself. The sensors could not get accurate readings because it existed partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. The coordinated attack began with the Vex High Empire launching reality-warping missiles that could erase entire solar systems from existence. The Luminari Collective followed with energy beams that burned hotter than the cores of stars, while the Krillian Republic fired antimatter torpedoes that could crack planets in half. For a few seconds, it looked like the combined firepower of multiple civilizations might actually work. Then the creature struck back, and Jake realized they had made a terrible mistake. Tendrils of pure void stretched across space, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, and each one was capable of draining the life from an entire battleship in seconds. The Devourer was not just destroying the vessels, but absorbing them completely, along with their crews and all the knowledge they contained. Pete Williams commanded the human destroyer squadron, and his voice came across the communication channels, with growing panic as he watched Krillian dreadnoughts simply vanish when the creature touched them. His final transmission before his own ship was consumed was brief and terrifying as he reported that the thing was not just eating matter, but somehow consuming the souls of everyone it touched. Lisa Carter monitored the battle from her science station and made a crucial observation that would later prove important. Unlike the alien vessels that simply disappeared when the creature touched them, human ships seemed to resist slightly longer. The difference was small and not enough to save anyone, but it suggested that something about human consciousness or life force affected the devourer differently than other species. The retreat became a panicked rout, as surviving ships desperately tried to escape the system, while the creature grew visibly larger and more powerful with each vessel it absorbed. The proud Vex High flagship, which had led their empire for 1,000 years, was consumed along with its entire crew of crystal beings. The luminary battle stations that existed as pure energy constructs were pulled into the creature's dark form. Like water going down a drain, Alex Turner watched the sensor readings with growing horror as he realized the devourer had not just survived their attack, but had actually become stronger because of it. The creature now moved faster through space, and its ability to manipulate reality had increased dramatically. It was learning from every civilization it consumed and adding their knowledge and abilities to its own. Of the 15,000 ships that had entered the Nexus system, less than 3,000 managed to escape, and many of those were damaged beyond repair. The flower of galactic civilization had been crushed in less than an hour, and the creature was now more powerful than ever before. Jake stared at the tactical displays, showing empty space where moments before, the greatest fleet in history had been fighting for survival. The journey back to Federation Central Command was conducted in stunned silence as the surviving crews tried to process what they had witnessed. The communication channels carried reports of species abandoning their core worlds and fleeing to the outer edges of the galaxy. The Vex High Empire announced they were sealing their remaining systems behind impenetrable barriers and abandoning the rest of the galaxy to save themselves. The Luminari Collective began a mass exodus to another galaxy, entirely rather than face the creature again. Dozens of smaller species simply vanished as their governments collapsed and their populations scattered in panic. The Federation itself was falling apart as member worlds realized that even their combined military might was useless against this cosmic horror. Back at New Geneva, the atmosphere was one of complete despair as Admiral Sullivan tried to maintain some kind of order while refugee ships arrived constantly carrying survivors from worlds that no longer existed. The strategic planning rooms that had once buzzed with confident military officers were now nearly empty as most of the alien representatives had fled back to their home systems. Jake found himself staring out at the stars and wondering how many of them would still be shining tomorrow. The creature was moving toward the galactic core, where billions of beings lived on thousands of worlds, and nothing they had tried could even slow it down. The most advanced weapons and the bravest warriors had been absorbed like everything else, but something was bothering Jake about what he had observed during the battle, and he could not shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The way human ships had resisted the creature's absorption for just a few extra seconds suggested there was something different about human consciousness that the devourer found difficult to process. Lisa was working frantically in her laboratory, analyzing every scrap of data from the battle, while Alex ran calculations on the creature's movement patterns. They were trying to find any weakness or pattern they could exploit, but the devourer seemed to be beyond the reach of conventional science or military tactics. Against all orders and military protocol, Jake made a decision that everyone would later call insane. He was going to take his ship directly to the creature, not to fight it, but to study it up close. If they were going to find a way to stop this thing, they needed to understand what it really was, and that meant getting closer than anyone had ever survived before. The crew of the Starbound looked at their captain with expressions ranging from admiration to terror when he announced his plan. They all knew it was probably suicide, but they also knew that someone had to try something different because conventional approaches had failed completely. The creature had consumed entire civilizations, and it was getting stronger with each victory A's. Jake prepared his ship for what might be their final mission. He wondered if humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat might actually be their greatest strength in a galaxy that seemed ready to give up and die. Jake Morrison took the Starbound on a course that every military manual said was suicide, and his skeleton crew of volunteers knew they were probably flying toward their deaths, but none of them suggested turning back. Lisa Carter sat at her science station, running continuous scans, while Alex Turner monitored the physics readings and Sam Cooper kept their engines running despite the impossible stresses they were encountering. Nina Walsh maintained communications with Federation Command as long as possible, but as they approached the Devourer, the radio signals became distorted and filled with voices speaking in languages that no living being had used for millions of years. The creature was not just consuming matter and energy, but somehow collecting the consciousness and memories of every civilization it had ever encountered. Their first close look at the cosmic horror revealed something that made everyone on the bridge feel sick with vertigo. The creature was not simply a monster, but an entire ecosystem existing in a space that should not be able to contain it. Within its dark form, they could detect the remnants of consumed worlds and civilizations, all existing in some kind of suspended, animation-like specimens in a cosmic museum. Lisa worked frantically at her instruments and made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about the situation. The Devourer was not destroying what it consumed, but collecting it and keeping it alive in a twisted universe within itself. Entire species that had been declared extinct were still conscious somewhere inside the creature, experiencing an existence beyond normal space and time. As they drew closer to the impossible entity, the crew began experiencing phenomena that should not have been possible according to any science they knew. They heard whispers in their minds, speaking languages they did not recognize, but somehow understood, and the voices belonged to beings from civilizations that had vanished eons before. Humanity had even evolved. Alex realized that the creature was not malicious in any way that human minds could comprehend because it was acting on instincts that had developed over cosmic timescales. It was like a whale that filtered plankton from the ocean, except that it fed on the life force of entire star systems, and it did not understand that what it was consuming represented billions of unique individual lives. The crucial moment came when the Devourer finally detected their small ship and extended a feeding tendril toward them that writhed through space like a living shadow. Instead of trying to flee or fight, Jake did something that no one in galactic history had ever attempted when faced with this creature, and he ordered Nina to broadcast everything they had. Every communication system on the ship began transmitting simultaneously on frequencies that spanned the entire electromagnetic spectrum and beyond. Nina sent out not distress calls or military communications, but something completely different that made the approaching tendril suddenly stop moving through space, as if the creature was confused by what it was receiving. The broadcasts contained every piece of human art and music and literature and cultural expression in their ship's database. Poetry written by farmers on frontier worlds, mixed with symphonies composed by the greatest masters of Earth and children's songs that mothers sang to help their babies sleep. The chaotic beauty of human creativity poured into space in all its contradictory and emotional and completely illogical glory. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Devourer hesitated, and its feeding tendril stopped just meters from their hull. The creature that had consumed the greatest civilizations in the galaxy without pause was suddenly uncertain about how to process something it had never encountered before. Human consciousness operated on principles that made no sense to an entity that had learned to absorb and organize the thoughts of countless species. The absorbed civilizations within the creature began responding to the human broadcasts, and their suppressed consciousness started to resurface as if they were being awakened from a deep sleep. The chaotic nature of human creativity was creating resonance effects throughout the creature's internal dimension, and the organized patterns it used to maintain control were becoming unstable. Lisa detected massive energy fluctuations within the Devourer as something like a rebellion began among the absorbed minds, and for the first time the creature's form flickered with lights that were not its own. The consciousness of entire species that had been trapped for eons was beginning to reassert itself in response to humanity's refusal to follow logical patterns. Jake realized they had found something that could confuse and potentially even overwhelm the creature. But he also understood that their small ship could not generate enough chaos to free the billions of minds trapped inside the cosmic horror. They needed more humans, and they needed them to be as unpredictable and contradictory and stubbornly alive as possible. The communication with Federation Command was breaking down as the creature's presence interfered with normal space. But Jake managed to send one final message before the signals became completely garbled. He told them that the Devourer could be stopped, but it would require humanity to do what they did best, which was to be absolutely impossible to understand or control as the Starbound drifted in space near the confused creature. Jake watched the lights flickering within its dark form and realized that every consumed civilization was still fighting for freedom somewhere inside that twisted dimension. They had found the key to victory, but using it would require a sacrifice that no military commander had ever asked of civilian populations. The creature's tendril withdrew, and the Devourer itself began to move away from their ship as if it needed time to process what it had encountered. For the first time since this crisis began, Jake felt something that might have been hope, because they had found a weapon that could hurt the cosmic horror. And that weapon was the simple human refusal to make sense. Sam Cooper looked up from his engineering station with excitement in his eyes as he reported that their engines were somehow running better than they had in years. The creature's presence was actually improving their ship's performance, as if human technology responded positively to the same chaos that confused the Devourer. As they prepared to return to Federation Command, Jake knew they were bringing back the galaxy's first hope for survival. But he also knew that what they were proposing would sound insane to every military strategist and political leader who heard it. They were going to save the galaxy by being as human as possible. Word of Jake Morrison's discovery spread through the remaining Federation forces like wildfire, and for the first time since the crisis began, there was something that might be called hope in the emergency planning sessions. Lisa Carter's biological analysis revealed why humans affected the creature differently, and the answer was both simple and completely insane. Human consciousness operated on quantum uncertainty principles that made it incredibly difficult for the Devourer to process and absorb the way it had learned to handle other species. Where alien minds followed predictable patterns that the creature could easily understand and control human thoughts, were chaotic and contradictory and changed direction without warning like a drunken sailor trying to walk a straight line. Admiral Grace Sullivan coordinated what had to be the most bizarre military operation in galactic history as they began evacuating human colonies not to safety, but directly into the creature's path. Every transport ship and civilian vessel in human space was pressed into service as they concentrated humanity's entire population in the systems where the Devourer was expected to appear next. The plan was so insane that most military strategists refused to even discuss it because it involved using civilians as bait in a cosmic-scale confrontation with something that had destroyed the greatest fleets in the galaxy. But volunteers flooded in from every human world when they learned they might be the galaxy's last hope for survival, and they came ready to be as human as possible. Rachel Brooks commanded the civilian evacuation fleet and worked with Alex Turner to modify every ship's communication systems so they could broadcast human culture across space. Every vessel became a traveling radio station, filling the void with music and poetry and philosophical debates and even arguments between married couples about whose turn it was to take out the garbage. The Devourer's behavior became increasingly erratic as it encountered these human settlements instead of its usual swift consumption patterns. The creature began to slow down, and its dark form flickered with strange lights as the absorbed civilizations within it responded to humanity's chaotic broadcasts, and their suppressed consciousness began to resurface. Jake Morrison continued operating within the creature's influence zone and discovered he could actually communicate with some of the absorbed minds that had been trapped for eons. A Vex-High scientist whose crystal form had been consumed managed to make contact, and her thoughts somehow resonated with human neural patterns in ways that neither species understood. The crystalline being revealed that consumed civilizations retained awareness within the creature and had been trying to fight back for millions of years. But they needed something to disrupt the Devourer's perfect control over their consciousness. Human chaos was providing exactly the kind of disruption they had been waiting for, and absorbed minds throughout the creature were beginning to remember who they had been. The climactic sequence began when the Devourer reached the Centauri system, where humanity had concentrated its largest civilian population, and instead of immediately attacking the creature, seemed confused by what it encountered. The humans were not fleeing or fighting, but were actually volunteering to be absorbed while maintaining active communication links with each other. Roy Mitchell was a veteran captain who had fought pirates in the Outer Rim conflicts, and he led the first group of volunteers who allowed themselves to be taken by the creature while broadcasting their thoughts and experiences to everyone who could hear them. Instead of the usual silent absorption, the process became chaotic and unpredictable as human consciousness proved impossible to properly organize. The volunteers found themselves inside the creature's internal dimension, where they discovered a vast universe of consumed civilizations existing in perfect sterile order, exactly what the Devourer needed to maintain control over billions of absorbed minds. But humans refused to follow the organizational patterns, and their presence began destabilizing everything. The absorbed aliens began learning from human examples how to be chaotic and unpredictable and individually defiant instead of accepting their fate with logical resignation. The Vex-High started creating crystal structures that made no sense, while the Luminary generated energy patterns of pure beauty rather than efficient organization, and dozens of other species began remembering what it meant to be themselves. The Devourer began convulsing as its internal harmony was shattered by the introduction of chaotic human consciousness, and for the first time in cosmic history, absorbed civilizations started breaking free from its control. Their own cultural identities were reasserting themselves as they learned from humanity that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to make sense. The creature's form in normal space began flickering and changing as the rebellion spread throughout its internal dimension, and the organized patterns it used to process absorbed consciousness became increasingly unstable. The entity that had consumed worlds with casual efficiency was now struggling to maintain control over its own collected minds. Jake watched from his ship as the cosmic horror began to transform, and he realized they were witnessing something that had never happened before in the history of the galaxy. The Devourer was learning what every human child eventually discovered, which was that sometimes the best response to an impossible situation was simply to refuse to accept it. The absorbed civilizations were using human stubbornness as a weapon against their captor, and the creature found itself facing a rebellion of consciousness that it had no idea how to handle. For eons it had fed on organized, logical minds, but now it was choking on the chaos of billions of beings who had learned to be gloriously and impossibly alive. As the transformation continued, Jake knew they were about to witness either the galaxy's salvation or its final destruction, because there was no telling what would happen when a cosmic entity that had existed for millions of years suddenly discovered what it meant to be confused. The final confrontation did not take place in normal space, but within the Devourer's internal dimension, where Jake Morrison and his team of volunteers had allowed themselves to be absorbed on their own terms. Inside the creature, they found a universe that operated according to the entity's need for perfect order and control, but human stubbornness proved to be a force of nature that could not be organized or contained. The internal realm was vast beyond imagination and filled with the consciousness of every civilization the creature had ever consumed, all existing in a state of crystalline perfection that allowed the Devourer to process and control their thoughts. But Jake and his fellow humans refused to accept the imposed harmony, and their chaotic presence began creating ripples of disorder throughout the cosmic entity's carefully maintained system. Lisa Carter found herself in a space where biology and physics followed completely different rules, but her human mind simply adapted and kept working, while the absorbed alien scientists around her struggled to understand how she could function in an environment that made no logical sense. She began teaching them that sometimes the best scientific method was to try things that should not work, and see what happened. Sam Cooper discovered that human engineering principles worked even better in this impossible dimension because the Devourer's reality responded to stubborn determination in ways that defied every law of physics. He started showing absorbed engineers from a dozen different species how to build things that should not exist, but somehow worked perfectly anyway. The breakthrough came when Jake encountered the consciousness that had been the Devourer's first victim millions of years ago. The ancient entity called itself the Gardener, and it had once worked to cultivate life throughout the galaxy before being absorbed by what had originally been its partner in cosmic development. The creature had been designed to clear away failed ecosystems so new life could flourish, but something had gone wrong. The Gardener revealed that the Devourer had become trapped in an endless cycle of consumption without purpose after a cosmic accident damaged both their consciousness and their understanding of their original mission. For eons, it had been feeding on civilizations because that was all it remembered how to do. But it had never learned how to release what it had collected or return to its purpose of nurturing life. Working together with absorbed representatives from dozens of species, Jake began organizing a rebellion that was based on the simple human principle that everyone deserved to be free to make their own choices, even if those choices made no sense to anyone else. The Vexhi created crystal structures of pure individual expression, while the Luminari generated energy patterns of incredible beauty that served no logical purpose except to be wonderful. The cosmic horror found itself facing something it had never encountered in millions of years of existence, which was conscious beings who absolutely refused to be controlled or organized, no matter how much sense it made. The humans had taught every absorbed civilization that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply say no to something that seemed inevitable. When Jake finally came face to face with the core consciousness of the Devourer itself, he found an entity that was completely confused by what was happening within its own internal dimension. The creature had expected to absorb him like all the others, but instead found itself trying to process a mind that changed direction every few seconds and refused to follow any pattern that made sense. The confrontation was not violent or dramatic, but rather like a conversation between a computer and a jazz musician, where neither participant understood what the other was trying to communicate. Jake did not threaten the creature or try to bargain with it or offer it anything in exchange for freedom. Instead, he simply looked at the cosmic entity and said the most human thing possible. He said enough. The single word carried the weight of every human who had ever refused to give up when facing impossible odds, and every person who had stood against authority simply because they believed it was wrong. It contained the essence of every stubborn act of defiance in human history, and every moment when someone had decided that some things were more important than survival or logic or making sense. The Devourer found itself unable to process or absorb that simple human concept because it represented something that existed outside its understanding of how consciousness was supposed to work. The word enough contained multitudes of meaning and contradiction and individual choice that the creature could not organize or control no matter how hard it tried. Faced with a form of consciousness it could neither understand nor absorb, the cosmic entity began to unravel, but instead of dying, it started remembering what it had been before the accident damaged its purpose. The absorbed civilizations were released as the creature transformed back into its original form, and the Gardener emerged to help guide the process of restoration. The consumed worlds were restored through cosmic forces that operated beyond normal. Understanding and billions of beings found themselves alive again on planets that had been recreated exactly as they had been before the Devourer's arrival. The creature itself became the gardener's partner once more and began its original purpose of seeding new life throughout the galaxy, instead of consuming existing civilizations. Jake found himself back aboard the Starbound, watching as the transformed entity began creating new worlds filled with possibilities that had never existed before. The galaxy was forever changed, not just because the threat was ended, but because humanity's chaotic influence had inspired other species to embrace unpredictability and individual expression as strengths rather than weaknesses. The reformed Galactic Federation offered humanity a leadership position in galactic affairs, but Jake's response was typically human when he suggested they should all try to figure things out together because nobody really knew what they were doing anyway, and that was exactly what made life worth living. In the end, the creature that had devoured worlds learned that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was not advanced technology or ancient wisdom or perfect logic, but simply a stubborn human being who refused to accept that something was impossible and was willing to say enough when everyone else had given up hope.